Welcome to the Counselling Tutor podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, and welcome to the Counselling Tutor podcast with me, Rory Lees-Oakes. And as always, at the other side of the screen and at the other side of the county, the man of action, Mr. Ken Kelly. How you doing, Ken?
Oh, I'm very well, Rory, and it's great to be here. It's great to bring you episode 11, and I really like that introduction, the man of action. I do like that. I think
you are the man of action.
I'm going to call myself from now on, I am Ken, the man of action. It's very James Bondy, isn't it?
It is. You'd have to get yourself a shirt maybe with C on for counsellor. Tuck your underpants, put your underpants over your trousers, and start counselling maybe in a phone box or something. I don't know what the ethics of that are, but it sounds different, doesn't it?
I like it, and I'm sure if you're tuning into this as your first episode, you're probably wondering what's going on here. It's called congruence, and it is. Counselling is a serious subject. You know, we deal with serious stuff, but doesn't mean that you can't have fun while you're learning. In fact, I think if you're not having fun while you're learning, you're missing out on something.
Absolutely.
So what can you expect in episode 11 of the Counselling Tutor podcast? We've got something really good for you. We're going to kick off with a bit of a debate. I'm going to keep that secret until we go into it because it's coming up in just a moment. Then we're going to be handing over to Rory, Theory with Rory. He's going to be speaking about transactional analysis. So looking at the kind of the foundations of TA. So again, get your notepads and your pens ready for that. Lots of trigger vocab that you can pop in your assignments from that one over there. In Skills with Ken, I'm going to be doing the first section of the 7 stages of process. Of course, that's not a skill, but Carl Rogers identified 7 stages that a client might move through, and having a knowledge and understanding of what they are is really helpful when you are in client contact. You want to be knowing where the client is and seeing when there is a movement over there. So that's what we're going to be looking at there. And then Rory and I in Ask Ken and Rory are going to be speaking about supervision, because there's a lot of debate on the Facebook group about supervision. And of course, if you want to be involved in that debate, where do they go, Rory, if they want to join our Facebook group?
Well, they go to www.counsellingtutor.com. Remember, there's 2 L's in counselling. We're not in America. And you go onto that site. On the right-hand side, there's a little button. Just press it. It says Facebook, and you can join our group. It's a closed group, so you have to knock on the door to get in, and you just say, "Can I join?" And we say, "Yes, of course, welcome." And what you find there is just a vibrant community. I think as of today's date, which is the 16th of April 2016, we've got something like 1,500 people. 1,500 people. There's practitioners, there's students, and there's also tutors like ourselves, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. So come in and ask your questions. That's what it's there for, right, Ken?
We're here for you. And in fact, today's kick-off topic that Rory and I are going to kind of just discuss and debate here comes from the very Facebook group that we've just mentioned. And it's around note-taking. So what's your thoughts on note-taking, Rory?
I think I'll make a note of that, Ken.
Oh, I like it. I know that you've got a unique and interesting way of keeping your notes.
I have. I do mine. First of all, I have an Android phone which is password protected to death, and what I do is I audio record my notes, and I load them up to my own cloud server. I've got my own server at home where they're stored securely, again behind a firewall. So because I'm dyslexic, I really, really struggle with writing things down. So what I do is after the session, I fire my phone up, I record them onto my phone, and then when I get near a Wi-Fi point or at home, I just send them across. And here's the thing, Ken, even if we had someone from MI5 intercepting them, no one would have a first clue of whom I was talking about, or who I was, or what really, or could have any idea who the client was. And that's because I keep my notes in a split note system. And I'll tell you a little bit about that. I give every one of my clients a code number. It really is like MI5, isn't it?
It is.
And it is. And then I talk about what's in the session. And I think the thing about note taking is, and I have this in my classes all the time, what do I write down? What do I put in my notes? Well, it's got to be factual information. Remember that if your notes are ever asked for by a court or, sadly, a coroner, those are the two people who can ask for them. And indeed, the client's got a legal right to access their notes. They need to be factual. They're not a lot of supposition or fantasy. So notes shouldn't be, well, I think the client's this and I believe the client's that. And, I think this is what's going on for them. Unless the client's actually stated it, then you don't put it in your notes. Your notes are a verbatim account of what's happened, and it doesn't have to be chapter and verse.
Yeah.
So I would talk about maybe the presenting issue. So say, for instance, client's having trouble in a relationship. Client states that, and then I put in inverted commas, I'm having trouble in my relationship. And I'd put that in. And I also might put in if I'd had to do any referrals. So I'd say, spoke with the client and client's agreed to a referral to, and then I put who the referral details were. And then I might put a few details in of maybe my contact. But they have to be factual, because if you go to a court of law and you're asked about your notes and the barrister says, so are you a psychiatrist? And you go, no, I'm a counsellor. And they say, well, why have you said I think the client's got a personality disorder?
Yeah.
Yeah. Or
100%.
You think, who told you the client's having trouble with alcohol or substance misuse? Well, I kind of thought it. Right. So you're not an expert in it. And before long, you can get into really deep water. So there's the first thing I'd like to get across today. Accurate notes of what's happened.
100% there, Rory.
Yeah.
And I think it all starts with what are the notes for? Have a good think about what is the purpose of the notes and how much detail you need to go into in your notes. So if the notes are for you to refer to and kind of track the progress of the client, what is it that you might need there? And again, as Rory has said, just sticking to that is important, that you know as truth, that the client kind of brought and that you know that if questioned is not going to take you on all different kinds of tangents. Now, if we look at the requirement to keep notes as of today, and Rory, you've already popped a date in of where we are today. We're in April of 2016. If you're in the UK, you don't have to keep notes. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't keep notes, but there is no, I guess, ethical requirement in the BACP Code of Ethics as it stands at the moment. If you don't keep notes, it will be questioned, but you can get away with it. However, as of July, when the new ethical framework comes into effect, you have to keep notes. It is an ethical requirement. So this is definitely worth considering how you will keep your notes. My notes are paper notes, but I also work to the split note system that Rory has mentioned. In that, on the paper notes that I write out, the only identifying factor to link it to the client is a number at the top. And I will refer to client brought this. Clients maybe said this. And again, if I needed to, I know who the clients are, but if I needed to reference that maybe in a year, 5 years' time, I would be able to go and look at the number that corresponds with that client, which is kept separately, not secretly. I suppose it is secretly as well if we're talking about MI5. And the purpose of that is if my office was broken into and my filing cabinet was forced open and that file was taken, it would mean nothing to anybody because there is no identifiable information in there.
Absolutely, Ken. And that's the key thing. We take reasonable precautions about note keeping so that they don't go into the public domain. Anybody who's been taught by me laugh out loud when I say that I actually take my hard drives out of my computer and store them in the loft after wiping them with military encryption software. But, we can't be too careful when we're storing information. People can retrieve it. And a few years ago, there was a tabloid newspaper in the UK that went to a corporation or a tip where people throw stuff away. That's what we call them in this country. I call them a refuse depot, probably in America. And they just went in and fished out a few computers, took the hard drives out, and using nifty software, managed to get everything off the hard drive. So there's a lesson in that. If you're storing anything on a computer, just make sure that when you get rid of your computer, you wipe it clear. And you have to keep the notes secure. and make sure that no one can access them. So when we come to accessing them, I think this is a pertinent point, Ken. Who has access to your notes? Well, the answer there is the client has a legal right, should I say,
yes,
to have access to their notes. A coroner can access your notes if sadly a client dies and there's a coroner's inquest, and also your notes can be asked for by a judge with a court order. So recently I've had dealings with our colleagues in the police force, and they've said to me, can you send your notes? And I've said, if you send me either the client's declaration that they want them released, or alternatively you get a court order, no problem. And it went back and forward and back and forward and back and forward. And the police kept saying, well, can you get a court order, And I kept saying, sure you can. I said, but unless I get the client's permission, my notes ain't going anywhere.
100% right. And know what your rights are. And Rory's just painted them for you there.
Yeah.
A court order. So if the police come and knock on your door and say, we need those notes, please, you can say, where is your court order? Because the last thing we want as counsellors, as therapists, is to be handing over information that could potentially damage a client. A client that came to us in a fragile place for our help. Can you imagine? I just don't even dare think of harming that client. It's in our ethical framework. Do no harm.
Absolutely. It's under non-maleficence, Ken, which is the BACP's version of do no harm. And we do want to work cooperatively with our colleagues in services. They're not the enemy, but, there are certain protocols that we have to go through. And in both the cases, I got permission from the client to disclose, sent the notes off, and that was more or less the end of it. I've not heard anything since. So we have to be very careful. And, here's a lesson. When I worked for a national charity as a counsellor, we would on a regular basis, get people doing fishing trips, solicitors phoning up saying, oh, yes, can you send the notes for such and such a body? We'll send you data protection forms. And what they were trying to do was get the notes through the back door, because obviously there'd been a divorce or there'd been some sort of case, and the notes could have been seen as vital evidence to try and get a legal point across.
100%.
But unless the client wants them released, or there's a court order, or there's a coroner's court, then the notes shouldn't be going anywhere.
100%. And here's the thing. When you find yourself, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you do have a court order and they are asking for your notes, you can also ask if it's okay for you to provide a précis or a summary of what is in the notes. And you can bargain and say, is it okay if I just write a summary of what's in my notes? And there are occasions when they will say, yeah, that's great, send your summary through. And then that means that you hold on to your notes. And of course, if you've got stuff, be careful what you put in your notes, because they can be asked for under those conditions. And if you have other stuff going on that you feel you want to write down, then use a process jotter for that.
Yes, and I think there's something about process notes. Process notes are notes where you can do exactly what I've said don't do in your formal note taking, and that's you can write down what you think's going on for the client, how you feel, what the process is, and that usually for person-centered therapists is a personal journal. And you can write to your heart's content, because sometimes, as we'll touch in supervision in our next segment, you want to explore and maybe fantasize about what's going on for the client in supervision. That's fine, but be aware of this word of warning. Any information that you have can be asked for by a court order. They can literally take the socks off your feet.
Yes.
With a court order.
100%.
So, and if they ask you, do you have process notes? And you say yes, then technically you are perverting the course of justice.
Yeah, and they can ask for it. And the wording on that is important as well. So one word is process notes, and the other one is jottings, personal jottings. And
yes.
Personal jottings they are unlikely to ask for. Process notes they may well ask for if they have an understanding that counsellors and psychotherapists do kind of make those notes. So just to end this off, I think really important is if you are electronically storing any information on your clients, it will fall under the Data Protection Act. Well, I can't say it will. You need to check. You need to make sure. And you can do that if you're in the UK at the website ico.org.uk. client.The. You can go on through to that website, and you can actually do a little test on the website. Do I need to register for data protection? It's basically there to protect the rights of people and their data.
Absolutely. And one final thing, I've had colleagues who've worked in shelters for women who've been survivors of abusive relationships, and sometimes they say we don't want notes taken. In which case, the defensible decision, and you'd have to take that up with your supervisor and maybe the BACP, would be to write in your notes, clients ask me not to take notes.
100%. 100%. I like that. Hopefully there's some food for thought there. And as Rory and I have debated this and kind of kicked the ball between one another, I challenge you to go and speak to your peers, go into your learning institution and bring up this topic. Speak to your tutor about it, speak to your peers about it. It's an interesting debate, and it's one well worth having. Because if you have a conversation like this and you do find one day a court order comes to your office or through your door, it's something that you've considered. It doesn't sideswipe you, I guess.
Absolutely. And hey, Ken, why don't we do a free giveaway? Why don't we put into the website a little download, and they can have a sample of a set of notes that I've written. They're not about a client. I just write them and show them how they should be presented for my students in the format they should be delivered. What do you think? Give that away?
I think that is an absolutely brilliant idea. If you want to grab that, you just go to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab. This is podcast episode 11, and you'll find the link to that in the show notes. Thank you very much, Rory. And Rory, I believe that as we move now into theory with Rory, we're going to be looking at transactional analysis today. Now, that's a very broad topic. If I know transactional analysis, I know you could probably fill a library with the theory.
Well, I've got an interesting story about that. Many years ago, Eric Byrne, who developed TA, was on an aeroplane, and he was sat next to an eminent astrophysicist, and the astrophysicist said, "What do you do?" And Eric Byrne said, "Well, I'm a psychotherapist." And he said, "I developed transactional analysis." To which the astrophysicist said, parent, adult, and child. To which Eric Byrne replied, "Yeah, astrophysics, twinkle, twinkle, little star." So that gives you some idea of the depth of TA, and we're not going to go into the huge depth of TA, but I'm going to do the first lesson on it just to give you some idea of maybe TA and how it differs to person-centered therapy. There is distinct differences, so that's what we're going to be doing in Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees Oakes.
A few years ago, I was due to deliver some training for a drugs team. I parked my car in the car park and walked towards the building where the training was to be delivered, only to look down and find on the floor a conker. I picked it up and held it in my hands, and I was instantly transformed and transported back to when I was a child. I was no longer an adult waiting to deliver some training, but a 10-year-old boy again, thinking about his playground break, playing conkers with his mates, and would I put the conker in vinegar to make it stronger or cover it in varnish? I'd lost, for that small moment in time, all sense of who I was as an adult, and was quite happily thinking as a 10-year-old. The only trouble with that is the people who'd paid good money to see me train and to learn things weren't going to be too impressed if they had someone stood in front of them with a conker on a string. So I had to have a bit of a word with myself. I had to say to myself, well, Rory, perhaps you can play with the conker later. It's fine. Conkers are okay. But really, the people who want to see you really want an adult. And with that word to myself firmly in place, I went back into my adult ego state, put the conker in my pocket, and went on to deliver the training. And this little story links nicely into some theory developed by Eric Byrne. Eric Byrne was a psychiatrist who developed transactional analysis, sometimes known as TA. And he based it on 3 very strong principles. And before I explain those principles, I'd like to say that in this little broadcast, I'm only going to touch the surface of TA. So for those of you who are doing comparisons maybe with a main model of therapy, this may very well be useful. But transactional analysis is a wide theory. There's lots of different schools of transactional analysis, and it would take more than one little podcast to cover it. So Eric Byrne's motivation for developing TA is quite interesting. After he graduated from medical school, he went to America and went on to study psychiatry at Yale University. And then he went on to study psychoanalytical therapy, the work of Freud, in 1941. And the interesting thing was he finished his training and applied for membership of the Psychoanalytical Society in 1956, and he had his application turned down. And because of that, he went on to develop his own ideas. And one of the greatest ideas that Byrne left as his legacy was called the pack ego model. And I'm going to explain that. And I'm also going to put a handout. So if you are listening on the iTunes download, if you go to www.counsellingtutor.com, remember there's 2 L's in counselling, it's not the American spelling, and you go to the website and you look at the podcast episode, you'll find that we've got some resources in there and you can download them. It's a free download. So what is the pack ego model? Well, the pack ego model is 3 distinct states that we find ourselves in. And unlike person-centered therapy that sees us as a complete organismic whole, the pack ego model sees us as 3 distinct ego states. So the best way to think of these ego states is 3 circles stacked on top of each other. The first circle is called P for parent. The second is called A for adult. And the bottom circle is called C for child. Now, the parent ego state is the thoughts and feelings that are transmitted to us by our parents. So the first position of TA is that as children, we are like a recorder. We're like a digital recorder. We listen to what our parents tell us, and to some extent we believe that's the absolute truth. And it can be parents or it can be teachers, and we take that in because they're the big people. They're the people who've survived in the world. They're the people who control us. Therefore, in the child's mind, they must be right. Okay. And we carry some of the attitudes of our parents around with us, a bit like a tape loop. And I'll give you an example of that. A few weeks ago, I was having something to eat with our daughter, and she was gesticulating with a knife, and I said, "Put that knife away, you'll have your eye out with it." And my daughter doesn't need a lecture on the use of a knife, as she told me. But what was really interesting, in that moment, I'd actually accessed what I'd been told as a child. I was replaying, like a tape loop, the messages that I'd received as a child, because I'd been told that as a child. And I'd ended up in really what was called a critical parent ego state. So the first thing that we're going to look at is how the parent is split. So in that P circle, it's split, it's divided. And on one side, we have the critical parent. On the other side, we have the nurturing parent. Now, a critical parent is really the messages we get about shoulds, must, have to. And also, it's kind of very autocratic. It's those messages like, put that knife down, you'll have your eye out with it. On the other side, we have the nurturing parent. And nurturing parents are nurturers, the voice of acceptance, self-regulation and self-soothing. And although those are very worthy values in a human being, they're not always appropriate for every situation we find ourselves in life. If I was having a business meeting with a colleague and they started to say, "Oh, are you all right? Ooh, would you like me to get you some water? Ooh, you're looking a bit peaky today. Maybe if you put a coat on," I'd be thinking, what the heck's this person talking about? I don't need advice on how to dress, thank you. I'm 58 years old. So sometimes that ego state, those messages that we get from our parents can leak in to our everyday conversations. And sometimes they're not really useful. So that's the parent ego state. And as I say, those are things that we're taught by our parents that we play back as a loop. Now, there are some times when there are some instances, certainly if you are a parent, where having a critical voice like don't put your finger in electric sockets, don't drink bleach, and a nurturing voice like, "Oh, you all right? You want a plaster on your knee?" are quite appropriate, but they're not appropriate in every situation. And that's the difference. And people who put this ego state into every situation may very well find themselves having trouble with communication. People might think, oh no, I'm not wanting to have a meeting with that person again. That sounds exactly like my dad. Yeah. Now, the adult ego state is one that's free of those parental tapes and the history of the way we were brought up. The adult ego state is an observer, an organiser, there's some analysis in there, and it can think logically and rationally and act accordingly. So when people are in an adult ego state, there's more chance of really clear communication, and also that people feel that they can communicate back. And that's the adult ego state. And that's not got a line through it. The adult ego state doesn't have a critical or a nurturing side. It's just the adult ego state, the logical, rational personality where people communicate with each other without access to either a parent ideas or a child's ideas, being childish. And finally, talking about child's ideas, the third circle is called child. And again, that's split down the middle. There's the adaptive child and the free child. Now, going back to the conquer, I was in the free child ego state because what I was doing was I was going, oh, fantastic, I'm going to play conkers. I'm going to have a conker. I'm going to put it in vinegar. I'm going to varnish it. It's going to be 100er. I'm going to be the most popular person in, yes, back to the adult ego state again. And free child is really good for your self-expression, developing ideas, and just having a bit of fun. And I'll make the point that Burns said that through the day we probably go up and down the ego states, but if we get fixed in any one, then maybe we're not going to be the best communicators. No one wants a business meeting with someone who's talking like a child, and again, no one wants a business meeting with someone who is talking like their parents. But occasionally those kind of attitudes slip in. But as long as they're not predominant and we know the appropriate time to use the appropriate ego state, then we're probably going to be good communicators, and our relationships with other people are going to be very good. Now, on the other side of the free child ego state is called the adaptive child. And that's the part of self that makes emotional decisions about the self based on the rules our parents have put in. So if we're told certain things as children, then very, very much as we move into this ego state, we'll be looking for approval. And that can be a pretty difficult place for people to be. And I remember many years ago working with a colleague who would perennially say to me, is that all right? Have I done the right thing? And I go, well, what do you think you've done? And what you tell me. And she was literally insistent on me giving her praise to boost her self-esteem. And it became quite difficult because I wasn't her parent. And here's the thing, what can happen is that if we get stuck in one ego state, it might be that we're continually in this kind of loop where we're looking for parental praise from everyone we meet in life. And again, that's not a healthy place to be. So that's the adaptive child. And the idea of TA therapy is to try and strengthen and recognise the adult part of us. So that differs a lot from humanistic therapy. It's about finding out which ego state isn't useful to us anymore and making decisions about how we're going to act in maybe a different ego state. So I hope that little presentation on parent, adult, child has been useful. I've put some handouts in the download, www.counsellingtutor.com. Click on podcasts and find this episode. Click onto it and you'll be able to find the download. And I know some of you may be asking, what about the conquer? Well, as it happened, when I'd finished the training session, I went home and our daughter turned up and I said, do you fancy a game of conkers? And she said, yes. So we stood in the garden with our conkers, both being 10-year-olds. It was appropriate, it was fun, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I lost. My conker broke. but it's about the appropriate ego state for the time and the relationship that you're having.
It's such an interesting theory, Rory, and I just remember back when I was a student and learning the PAC model of TA, of actually seeing those ego states within myself. And I found myself for weeks afterwards walking around and wondering what ego state I was in. And kind of when I was speaking to people or watching transactions, I guess, play out, going, I wonder what ego state they're in. It's just such fascinating theory.
It is, and it's a huge C. It literally is a huge C. My good friend Bob Cook, who is at the Manchester Institute for Psychotherapy and is a TA specialist, will tell you it's literally an ocean, and we just got to touch really on the comparison stuff for the guys out there who are doing comparisons against maybe a main model of person-centered or Gestalt. So he's going to be touching on really the surface area of it because it is such a big theory. So anyway, Ken, Skills with Ken, what we're looking at today, Ken?
Heading into the territory of Mr. Carl Rogers, I guess very different. You were speaking about comparative models there, and one of the comparative models we often see in assignments is a comparison between the person-centered approach and TA that you've just been bringing here. And of course, a big whacker theory in the person-centered approach to counselling is the 7 stages of process, which we're going to be covering in skills today. And I'm very familiar that 7 stages of process is not a skill. However, it is something that is present with you, part of your awareness as a counsellor when you are face-to-face in the trenches with the client. So having a working understanding of how the 7 stages of process links in to actual face-to-face therapy, I think is important.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely a not to be missed section, this, and it is just so important. It's one of the few, I'd say, pieces of theory that is just so important, not only for understanding where the client's process is, but also being able to speak a common language when you're visiting and seeing your supervisor.
Counselling Skills with Ken Kelly.
Carl Rogers came up with a theory which he entitled the 7 stages of process. So why would we be bringing a theory into our skills session? And I guess the reason for this is because very often in our assignments and in our studies as counsellors, we're asked to relate theory to practice. And this is a great example of where we're going to take the theory of the 7 stages of process and bring that into our practice, into our therapy room, into our relationship with the client. And rather than look at the theory in its dry state, as we may if we were answering a theory question, we're going to link this to practice and try to see how it informs practice, what we can look out for, and how we can see these stages in motion. Back in 1961, Rogers's book was published called On Becoming a Person. And it's in this book that we see the best writings of the 7 stages of process. And I just want to take an actual quote from the book. Let's hear it in Rogers's words. This is him describing what the 7 stages of process is. And he says, "Individuals move, I began to see, not from fixity to homeostasis. Through the change to a new fixity, though such process is indeed possible, but much more significant continuum is from fixity to changedness, from rigid structure to flow, from stasis to process." So some rather big words there, but yes, a great quote to put in an assignment. But what does it actually mean if we put that into simpler terms? What Carl Rogers is saying is that it's not that a person comes in with really rigid and fixed views and then goes through a process within the therapeutic relationship and those views change to different fixed views. It's rather a process of going from having really fixed and rigid ways of looking at the world, and hopefully if we move through those stages of process to a more fully functioning person, as we refer to it, we can see a loosening of that self-structure. So it is being more open and more accepting. So it's not from rigidity to a different kind of rigidity, but more from rigidity to a more fluid and accepting self-structure. And according to Rogers, personality is a process that can be split into 7 stages. Stage 1, he mentions that the organism is fixed, rigid, stuck, anxious, and incongruent, through to stage 7, where the organism is fluid, spontaneous, and congruent. And I guess Roger's speaking about the organism is referring to us as people, the human condition, our clients, the way we are and the way we interact with our world. Today we're going to take the first 3 of Roger's 7 stages and examine them and look at how they fit into our counselling relationships. And then next week we'll pick up on the other 4. So let's start off by going to Roger's book on becoming a person. We're going to look at page 132. So if you're referencing this for an assignment where you need to write about the 7 stages of process, 132 on becoming a person, that's where you want to be heading. I want to use Roger's words here. He says the first stage, the individual in this stage of fixity and remoteness of experience is not likely to come voluntary for therapy. However, I can to some degree illustrate the characteristics of this stage. So what he's saying is that it is unlikely as therapists that we're going to be seeing a person who is in stage 1, an extremely rigid, fixed position within their views of the world. We're very seldom going to see them walking into our therapy room. Rogers identifies that there's an unwillingness to communicate self, to bring any part of self. Communication is always about externals. So a person in this really fixed stage 1 will see anything, any kind of pain that they experience within their life as being purely external. Influences outside of their control causing them to feel this way. They will say that people, places, things cause them difficulty. Oh, that's a terrible place. You don't want to be going there. Those kind of people are such and such. They feel that talking about their feelings are a waste of time. They may say words like, people ought to do such and such. So they will have expectations on how people, places, and things should be. We're going to see generalized statements indicating a really rigid and narrow view of the world around them. So it is unlikely that we will see a person in our therapy room in stage 1. However, it is not impossible. So where might we see somebody in what Rogers describes as that first stage of process entering our therapy room? I'll give you an example. You may find a client coming in, sitting down, and when you ask them why they came into therapy, they may say, such a person, my wife, for instance, said I should come. If you're working as a college counsellor, that my teacher said I need to come and see you as the counsellor. And this is something really worth looking out for, because if a client is coming in and they're quite clearly not there for themselves, how can we build a therapeutic relationship with this person? Is it ethical for us to engage in therapy if a person feels that they're only there because somebody else suggested that they come in? Carl Rogers identifies that this person in stage 1 will not be able to notice and recognize the feelings within self. There would be nothing to process. There is a complete incongruence in this client entering therapy. And it may well be that the ethical thing to do, if a client says, well, my teacher said I needed to come in here, and you say, well, what do you feel about that? And they go, well, I don't think I've got any problems. You know, if anyone's got a problem here, it's the teacher. So therefore externalizing all of the responsibility in that really fixed state, that we might suggest to the client, well, you know, I'm here if you need me, and if you ever feel that you want to engage, I'm right here. And of course, you can come back into therapy, and allow them to leave, because there is no therapeutic process going to take place with this person. So let's have a look at stage 2. What might we see? How might we recognize stage 2 in our therapy room? Well, firstly, we're going to see just a slight loosening of the rigid constructs within stage 2. Although we're still going to notice that the client may present themselves with kind of having difficulty in accepting any kind of responsibility for their feelings within their own lives. So they may appear as victims within their own lives. Everything that is happening to them will once again be externalized. You may find them saying that they're living in this hostile world, or, you know, if you had a job like mine, you too would feel this way. If you had a wife like mine, you too would feel like this. If you had children like mine, you too would feel like this. That way that they look at the world with is for them a fact. It is the way it is, because the concept of self is still very, very rigid. So they don't see that they have an ability to influence their happiness within the world. It's almost like the world exhibits its will upon them. But what we may see is that they start to acknowledge that feelings are there, but they're not recognized as feelings. They will be kind of just underneath the surface, as Roger says, maybe on the edge of awareness. They're definitely not brought fully into awareness. And we may be able to start working with a client that is in stage 2. The client in stage 2 may use very broad statements, once again, by saying, well, it's always like that, isn't it? And the isn't it is a great indicator of a stage 2 client, because they're almost starting to try and question where they're coming for. They're feeling this pain. They're recognizing, at least to a minimal degree, that there is some kind of feeling within them, although they're not maybe able to verbalize that or pinpoint that, but it is there. It's on that edge of awareness. And they may start to show questioning exploration around what it is that they're feeling. A person at stage 2 may define themselves and where they are in the here and now in terms of their past life. So we may hear statements like, I can never get such and such right. I'm always finding myself in such a situation. So it's almost like evidencing where they are in the here and now by past experiences of past negative experiences. It's almost like, I could never do something like that. I can't ever get it finished on time. These are the kind of clues that we might get if we're seeing a client in stage 2. What is it that we can do as a therapist if we recognize that a client is at stage 2? Well, firstly, we are right there in that client's frame of reference with our empathic understanding of what it is like for them. It's not our job as counsellors to move them from stage 2 to stage 3. It is only our job to provide those necessary and sufficient conditions that Roger's identified as being the building blocks that allow the client, encourage the client, empower the client to move by themselves. So be there, reflect back exactly how you perceive their world for them, and trust in the process, and allow the client to find their own way. And finally, for today, we're going to look at stage 3. We'll pick up next week in the podcast with stages 4, 5, 6, and 7. So what is it that we might look for in a client to identify them as being at stage 3? There's a slight loosening of that rigidity. So stage 1 and 2, it was very close, very rigid, very fixed way of looking at the world, and there was very little movement there. So we're looking at a loosening of the attitudes. We might find that this client is more willing to talk about themselves. So there is the acknowledgement that they feel pain. There is the acknowledgement that that is their pain, whereas in 1 and 2, they're unlikely to look at that internal process. We're starting to see at stage 3 the acknowledgement that this is my pain. We may recognize within this client that is at stage 3 that they're more comfortable talking about the pain of the past than they are about talking about here and now pain that they're experiencing current day life. An example of that might be something like, when I was a kid, I did a lot of things that made me feel really bad. So they're bringing feelings from the past comfortably and laying them out. We may see in a client at stage 3 that the incongruence starts to show. We start seeing those contradictions in what they think and what they feel, and that may be coming out within our counselling relationships. And a contradiction in that may be something along the lines of, oh, I try so hard to be the perfect partner, but I fail all the time. It always goes wrong. So we're seeing the intention, but the feeling inside is contradicting that. We're seeing that incongruence manifesting itself in the words that the client is bringing. And at stage 3, we're going to notice that the client is open to different possibilities, different points of view. So not so rigid as in 1 and 2, where their point of view, what they project out at the world is the only way, more accepting that there are other ways of doing this, but still a tendency, I guess, to default to what their own self-concept tells them. So how might we work with a client who we recognize to be at stage 3 within our relationship? We want to use unconditional positive regard. We want to accept them just as they are. they will begin to unravel the stories themselves and delve deeply in as we reflect and use our skills to kind of put that back in front of them. But that unconditional positive regard allows them to feel safe. It allows them to be open to look at different ideas, different concepts, different ways of looking at things. And they will be bringing parts of self maybe that are not acceptable to them themselves. That parts of self which are unacceptable to self that they bring out. Oh, I shouldn't be this way. And we as the counsellor, we can accept that as part of them and fully accept it without judgment, unconditionally. And in seeing that we accept that and being at stage 3 and being open to other inputs and other ways of looking at things, the client may look at that and themselves start to accept that and move on to stage 4. So that kind of caps off the first 3 stages of process and how we might use that in our therapy room, what we might look for and how we may work with that. And next week, I look forward to looking at the remaining 4.
Well, I always enjoy listening to the 7 stages of process, and especially with such a fully functioning person like yourself, Ken. So,
thank you. I see what you did there. You're linking theory to practice here, and theory to the practice of podcasting.
It's what we do, Ken. So, yeah. So, in that stage 7, we're going to go into ask Ken and Rory, ask Rory and Ken even. So, we're going to do that. So, what's the question today, Ken?
Well, I'm just looking again in our Facebook page, and it's Rachel Spence. Great question. It's regarding supervision. Any thoughts on supervision? Would love a podcast on supervision. And I guess what she's looking for in her question is saying, what is it that you take to supervision? How does supervision work? What should you be considering going into supervision? And I'm going to bat this right over to you, Rory, because you are indeed a qualified supervisor, so more qualified to speak about this topic.
Well, I think thanks, Ken. I think the first thing in supervision really is to find a supervisor that you can work with. You know, I think when you're looking for supervision, find someone who you can tell the truth to, because I know that, you know, for people starting in early practice, there's sometimes fear of getting it wrong, fear of making mistakes, and a good supervisor should really understand that and support you and say, look, you know, it's okay. Sometimes we make mistakes and sometimes we don't get it right all the time. So just tell me a little bit about what's going on. But in terms of supervision, I think it's a collaborative effort. So you've got the supervisor who's a bit further on down the road in their practice experience. You know, they've studied supervision, so they understand really what questions to ask and the process of how people bring material to supervision. And it really forms a triangle. So I'm going to explain what the triangle is. That might be helpful. So draw a triangle in your mind. If you're driving, maybe do it when you get home. Yeah. Put a triangle in your mind, and at the top of the triangle, put normative. And then at the bottom left of the triangle, put formative. And at the right-hand side, put restorative. And in the middle, put a big E, and that's for ethics. Okay, and basically normative, formative, and restorative. Restorative is support, formative is information, and normative is kind of managerial, working in a managerial way, making sure that you're managing your practice. And through supervision, what happens is that you may go in and say, I'm really struggling with this client. I really need support because I just don't feel that I'm a good enough therapist. And the supervisor may ask you a number of questions, one of them which is, how much do you know about the presenting issue? Yeah. And usually at that point, someone says, well, I'm not really sure, which is fine because we can't know everything, can we, Ken? We can't know everything.
100%.
So what we do is then we say, okay, well, let's find out. And then we try to understand where the client's coming from. And I have to say that a good supervisor should draw on a little bit more than maybe the theory that you're studying. So they should have a good idea of things like transference and counter-transference, parallel process. We've done podcasts on that. Yep. Understanding of presenting issues such as bereavement or trauma or loss or the whole panoply of the human condition. There'll be some things the supervisor won't know. And and it's going to be a bigger part of supervision as we move into the new ethical framework, is about getting people to understand more deeply the presenting issues of clients. So how do you present the work? Well, what I do is I'm very fortunate. I have about a half hour's drive to my supervisor, and I usually kind of have a set agenda of what I want to discuss. And usually by the time I get there, it's changed. I have it in my mind, it's changed. But first of all, it's client work. So I would bring my clients, and then through the process of supervision, there's a backwards and forwards interaction. So initially it's for me to bring my clients, but having done that, it may be that the supervisor then asks me about where I am in terms of working with this client, or who does this client remind me of? So I would say be prepared first and foremost to bring your clients. If you've got 6 clients or 5 clients, then bring your clients. If you're a student, you should have about 4 clients. So bring your clients, and the supervisor will ask you about each one, should be taking notes, should remember your clients. My supervisor will say to me, how's, I'll make this name up, how's Bill doing? How's Bill doing? And I'll say, oh, yeah, okay. And should I tell you a little supervisor's trick, Ken?
Go ahead.
Okay. You've got to promise that you won't tell anybody I've told you this.
This is between you and me, Rory.
This is between you and me. Okay. So when I was taught supervision, one of the things I was taught was if a supervisee has 4 clients, and you say, okay, you've got 4 clients, so how are they doing? And you go, okay, well, Tom's okay, and Fred's, I could do speaking about Fred, and I could do speaking about Mo, and I could do speaking about Chung. I would say, let's speak about the client that you say is doing okay.
Yes.
And the other week I went to supervision, and I went in and I said, well, this client's doing okay. And my supervisor locked me with her lock-on stare, and she said, we'll talk about that client. And I said, I know what you're doing. I'm a supervisor too. She said, we'll still talk about him.
I like it. And you've brought some really valuable information there of how you can use supervision. What I really like is that you said, tell the truth. And
absolutely.
If there's anything that you're carrying in your practice that you might feel ashamed to go and share with your supervisor, that's what you need to be sharing. That's the stuff. That's what supervision is there for. I remember right in placement days, I had a client who walked in, and I'm going to be honest, I found her really attractive. I thought, wow, that is... and I felt uncomfortable about finding this client attractive. And boy, did I not want to take this to supervision. And I took it into supervision and was able to work through that. And I'm so glad I did. I'm so glad I had the courage to take in that I would normally, I guess, want to hide away and pretend wasn't there. The other thing that you mentioned that really resonated with me is find a supervisor you're comfortable with. Go and visit different supervisors and see who you get on with, see who fits with you. It can be a long-term relationship, supervision.
Absolutely.
You're going to be spending some serious time together. Find somebody that you resonate with.
Absolutely.
And of course, prepare for supervision. As you said, Rory, you have a 30-minute drive to go and see your supervisor. I put it to you, listening to this, what do you do to prepare for your supervision? Make preparations and go in and use that time. It's important. It's an important part of your learning.
Absolutely. And hey, why don't we ask people to go into the Facebook feed and share what they do to prepare for supervision? We'd like to hear from you. We'd like to hear from you guys. Go into the Facebook feed, go on to www.counsellingtutor.com, click on the Facebook feed. If you're a member, fantastic. If you're not, just ask to join. And just tell us and share with us, what do you do to prepare for supervision? Be really interested, because I think people do it in very, very different ways. I know at least one of my colleagues meditates before they go.
I like it. I really like that.
Yeah.
And hopefully, Rachel, that answers your question. One final thought for you, Rachel. Why not next time you go to your supervisor, sit down and say to your supervisor, today I'd like to look at how I can better use my supervision time, and work through that in supervision. Why not?
Absolutely.
So there you go. That's episode 11 of Counselling Tutor Podcast. I hope that there's been something there useful for you. Episode 12, of course, coming your way next week. And we're just grateful to have you as listeners. You can get the show notes for today's episode, counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab, go down to episode 11. It's all there neatly laid out with all the links and references that we've been talking about today, including that free download that Rory's making available for you.
Yep, and as always, guys, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.